The area we decided to do research on was video games. More specifically, whether or not adults thought that parents should allow their children to play shooting games.
We decided to study wording bias and see if the manner in which the questions were asked affected their responses. In order to test this, we had to come up with a biased question and an unbiased question.
Our unbiased question was, should parents allow their children to play shooting games? And our biased question was, given the violent nature and possible psychological effects on youth, should parents allow their children to play shooting games?
Our hypotheses were that for the unbiased questions, 20 people would say yes and 10 people would say no, and that for the biased question, 5 people would say yes and 25 people would say no.
We thought that the majority of people would let their children play shooting games, and that after changing the wording, we would see a major difference in the responses.
We went to Walmart to collect our data. Our original plan was to go to Kroger, but they said we could not survey people there. We asked 30 people for each question, making our total sample size 60 people.
Our method for surveying people was to ask every third person that walked out the door. If the person we tried to ask avoided us or said no, we waited another 3 people to maintain the randomization. We also did not ask any kids because that would obviously skew the data.
For groups of adults, they typically all agreed. If they did not agree, we went with the first person of the group to respond.
Here are the 2 graphs of our recorded data. The one on the right shows the unbiased responses, and the one on the left shows the biased responses.
For the unbiased question, 10 out of 30 people said parents should allow their children to play shooting games, and 20 out of 30 said they should not. This means that about 33% of the people said yes, and about 66% of the people said no.
The biased responses were not much different. 8 out of 30 people would allow their children to play the shooting games, even after the bias was added to the beginning of the question. 22 out of 30 people said they would not allow them to play shooting games. This means about 26% of people said yes, and 73% of people said no.
These responses are very far from what we expected them to be. Here you can see the sharp contrast of our predicted and actual responses for the unbiased question.
And here, you can see the difference between the predicted and the actual biased question responses. We were pretty close with our predictions for the biased question.
So, should parents allow their children to play shooting games?
Should they what?
Should parents allow their children to play shooting games? No. Thank you.
Is it?
Yeah, thank you so much.
Should parents allow their children to play shooting games?
I don't think so.
Okay, thank you.
So, given the violent nature and possible psychological effects on youth, should parents allow their children to play shooting games?
Yeah. Alright.
So, given the violent nature and possible psychological effects on children, should parents allow their children to play shooting games?
Shooting games?
Yeah. No? Okay. Thank you.
Based on our research, about 66% of people would not allow their children to play shooting games when asked in an unbiased way, and about 73% would not when asked in a biased way. There is a slight difference, but it is not statistically significant.
This is a limitation created by this project because it requires us to base our percentages off of only one trial. We would have to do the same trial many times and average the total to find more precise percentages.
With the data we collected, we can come to the conclusion that wording does not play a major role in determining the responses, at least for this question. We changed the wording of the question well, but many people just seem to disregard the first part of the biased question.
The wording could affect other questions, but did not have much of an impact on this one. We also acknowledge the fact that our responses are heavily biased because we asked people coming out of a Walmart in Sylvania. Had we asked people leaving GameStop, their responses would have probably been very different.
There is no way to prevent this inherent bias because it is based solely on location. Maybe in a larger survey, we could go to many different places and compare the responses between the people in each area.
In conclusion, our hypotheses were a little off, and we found no clear evidence that the wording affects the responses.